I must say that I allowed the recording. Listening to your comments, extensive comments, made me think that Labour Party as an institution staggers it from one crisis to another and is really in a terrible position. Three of people I regard as friends have not distinguished themselves in their shadow posts. David Lammy, to move him from justice to shadowing foreign policy is to me sad development. Johnny Reynolds to move from the Department of Work and Pensions, at least he knows something about that subject, and make him shadow business is sad. And to strip Ed, who's a friend, long-standing friend, from business and put him in climate might be a good thing because that is such an important portfolio. But in so many respects, we just don't seem to be doing what I'm going to be talking about this evening, which is constructing a progressive narrative. And that is what my work has been about over the last decade or more. And before I go into that, let me reveal something, which is that tomorrow I have every expectation that Mark Drakeford will be appointing me officially as an advisor working on the basic income pilot. I've been an informal advisor in recent months, and it's going to be formalized tomorrow afternoon, I'm led to believe. And I'm looking forward to that because I think I totally agree with what Dave said, that Mark is as a very principled, progressive leader. And I'm also working with Beth Winter, who's a fantastic Labour MP in Wales. So there are good things happening in Wales, but in the rest of the country, we are in a bad shape, let's be honest. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is based on a series of books, the first of which was published in early 2011. And I wanted to write a book that was bringing together all my economic work of my career in a way that non-economists could understand. I was hoping that would be the case, and in a way that was making a political statement about the emerging class structure in global capitalism. I had no idea at the time, of course, that it would change my own life and be something that has preoccupied me for the last decade. The book is called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. A lot of the old laborists and some Marxists have attacked me, but I persist in believing that the precariat is the emerging mass class, and it shouldn't be treated as some sort of residual or some sort of just small phenomenon. It has become the major mass class of global capitalism. And that book has been translated into 23 languages. Now that doesn't happen to a boring economist, but it has happened. And I've been asked to give over 500 presentations in 40 countries. And every single day since then, I think without exception, I receive emails from people around the world saying, this book is about me. I'm part of the precariat. And why aren't the politicians addressing the issues that preoccupy us in the precariat? Now, I had the privilege of being invited by John McDonnell to be an economic advisor in 2016. And I worked with John right up to the general election. He's a good man, good friend. And I constantly was telling him, John, please articulate a narrative around the precariat. He understood the precariat. He's told me that many times, but he found it very, very difficult to do so in the context of what was going on with Brexit and all the other problems that the left had at that time, and we don't need to go into that here. Now, the second book that I wrote was saying, if you were in the precariat, what sort of manifesto would you be wanting to take place? And how would it differ from the old proletariat manifesto 100 years ago, had there been one? And that produced a book called the Precariat Charter. But meanwhile, I was working on what I'm going to be talking about now, which is the economic context in which this new class structure was taking shape. And that resulted in a book, which I think is the one that Dave mentioned, called The Corruption of Capitalism. And the first edition came out in 2016. And this year, because it has sold a lot of copies, the publisher asked me, would you be prepared to write a new edition? And it came out earlier this year. And I found that the analysis has actually firmed up since 2016, and the information has accumulated. And I believe that this should be the powerful narrative. And that leads me to a critical point, which I would be trying to say to Starmer if he would listen to the desire for a narrative, which is the left only makes significant substantive progress when it has a clear understanding of the enemy, a clear understanding of the character of existing capitalism. And in that sense, also have a narrative that looks to the insecurities and aspirations of the emerging mass class. If you don't have those two in focus, you will drift around listening to focus groups and trying to make gestures here and there, trying to appeal to this group or that group, but you won't have a coherent strategy. And the conservatives will be able to pick us off one by one by saying they're doing the same thing and saying, taking your clothes and moving on. And you'll basically be left hopeless when the next election comes along and big finance will be funding the Tories and we'll get the same sort of set of lies, but without a coherent critique. Now, the narrative begins with what happened under Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the United States, with the emergence in the 1980s of what we call neoliberalism, a term that's bandied around all the time. But essentially, neoliberalism at the time was an attempt to recreate in imagery and in regulatory stance a sort of liberalized free market capitalism based on individualism and a dismantling of all the institutions of social solidarity and social progressiveness. The strategy of neoliberalism meant that the first thing they did was liberalize finance. And what I've argued in the books is that we are not in an era of neoliberalism today. Neoliberalism achieved a dismantling effect in the 1980s and 1990s, but what it created was something fundamentally different from what its protagonists claimed they were doing. And it was a big lie to say that they were promoting a free market capitalism. We today have the most unfree market system ever constructed. And it is a profound mistake for Starmer and others to be saying that the free market system is failing us, because we don't have a free market system that is either failing us or not failing us. It's the wrong way of positioning what has happened. And what has happened is that rentier capitalism has emerged and taken shape in the last 20, 30 years. And this nature of this rentier capitalism means that more and more of the income and the wealth goes to the owners of property. And it's basically a strategy for private property rights. And property in a broad sense, property in physical terms, in financial terms, and in intellectual property. And less of income is going to those who rely on labor. This part of the story is well established, and the sense that the wages have stagnated, the social income has fallen of people relying on labor has gone along with the emergence of the class structure, to which I'll come back to in a few minutes. The first thing that happened was that finance was deregulated in the Big Bang and in various other ways. And finance moved from being a functional part of capitalism to actually being the dominant force of capitalism. Today, finance and financial assets come to over 1,000% of our national income. This is completely unprecedented and is higher than in any other country. Although even in other countries, finance has become more and more a dominant force. And financialization has gone with the development of private equity, venture capital, securitization, various instruments that we don't need to go into this evening, but essentially has been a way of extracting rents and giving it to the financial plutocracy. Now, finance went along with the emergence of big tech in the Silicon Valley and big pharma in the United States mainly, in creating a globalized institutional structure, which I've analyzed in chapter 2 of the Corruption of Capitalism, in which they enthroned the US system of intellectual property rights. What that means is they've turned more and more things into commodities that can be turned into monopolies. And this means, for example, that patents have been globalized. Before 1995 and the passage of TRIPS, trade-related aspects of intellectual property, which was led very crucially by the chief executive of Pfizer, one of the COVID gainers from this system, as we all know, that design system meant that patents became a globalized part of rentier capitalism. What that means in plain English is that ideas were converted into monopolies in which anybody who filed a patent guarantees themselves or their company a monopoly profit for 20 years. In other words, if you file a patent, nobody else can compete with you. Nobody else can produce that commodity or that process. If this is a free market, I'm an idiot. Of course it's not a free market. Now, the claim they made was that this intellectual property system would enable people to take more risks because they would get a higher rate of return. But that is not the case. There is no correlation between the strengthening of intellectual property rights and economic growth, economic performance, productivity, you name it. In fact, what has been the really scandalous aspect of this is that the same corporations, the same financiers have enabled the state to finance companies doing the research and development from which they get their patents and their copyright and their industrial designs and so on. So today, there are more than 15 million patents in place. And what has happened is that a few big corporations, household names, basically have become hoovers, literally hoovering up patents. So they own thousands and thousands of patents, which gives them a monopolistic income flow that nobody else can get hold of. And then governments have made it worse by giving subsidies to encourage those corporations to come to Britain or wherever they want to come to. So the first aspect is that intellectual property rights has become the dominant force. Now, why is it that the left in Britain have not actually targeted that and said this is a system of total corrupted claims of a free market? It's completely unnecessary, it's not functional, and it results in terrible increases in inequality and conglomeration and monopolization by big, powerful multinationals. But they made one mistake, the designers of this system. It was designed to benefit the financial corporations and the big United States multinationals and a few Europeans, including a few British household name corporations. But they didn't take account of China. Back in 1995, China was an economic minnow still. But of course, it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 and immediately showed cleverness by starting doing a lot of patents themselves. So that by 2011, China had become easily the biggest patent filer in the world. And today, each year, it files more patents than the whole of the European Union and the United States put together. So basically now China has become a rival to the United States about being a rentier economy, plucking rental income through property rights. And that's defining the clash that's going to be taking place between China and the United States in the decade in front of us. In addition, another lie was that we need subsidies in order to encourage economic growth. This is part of the claims that have been made over the years. And as a consequence, the government in Britain and in other countries provides subsidies to rich corporations on a vast scale. It's completely regressive. In other words, it increases inequality. It's completely unlinked to improvements in productivity or need, and it is completely dysfunctional. I did a calculation in the book, and in Britain today, there are 1,190 forms of tax relief and subsidy. And the Treasury cannot calculate, it says, what the lost revenue from these are to a large extent, but it can do so for about 210 of those. And according to the Treasury's own statistics, which must be an underestimate by a big amount, the subsidies cost the Treasury, and i.e. us, foregone revenue per year of over 430 billion pounds. Now, if you think of subsidies as a distortion to markets, particularly if they go to corporations that have no need for those subsidies, then you can see that this has got nothing to do with a free market. One of the untold scandals of last year in the COVID was that the Bank of England and the Treasury were giving out billions, listen to my words, billions of pounds to corporations that were not threatened with bankruptcy. They gave £1 billion in interest-free loan to the German chemical company called BASF, BASF, which is the biggest chemical corporation in the world. And I checked the figures, and it had annual profits last year of 117 billion euro. In other words, it had no need to be given a huge subsidy. It was the biggest subsidy given by Sunak last year. Why aren't we doing something to mock what this is doing? And you look down the subsidies that were given during the COVID, and it makes incredible reading. So you find that they gave £600 million for interest-free loan to BP and to other big corporations that are super profitable and had no need for being bailed out. And the irony of ironies is BASF only had 800 employees in the UK at the beginning of COVID. Here it was given all that money, and today it has no employees in the UK. It's closed their units down. So what was the point? Now, subsidies are a distortion which should be part of the narrative. The next part of the narrative is this. One of the claims of successive governments is that they want to eradicate debt. But who wants debt? Finance. Finance wants debt. It wants people to be in debt because that's how it makes its money. What do you think they'd exist for? So they want to maximize private debt, corporate debt, and public debt. And they've done very well. Because before the pandemic, private household debt had risen to 87% of GDP. 87%. It used to be about 20%. And this means that you have millions of people who are on the edge of unsustainable debt. A downturn would easily lead to massive homelessness, as we've been seeing, is exactly what is happening. But also corporate debt has risen to about 3/4 of national income. Corporate debt often by corporations that are deliberately creating high corporate debt for themselves while distributing the profits in dividends to their foreign shareholders, maximizing the debt they're overhanging their corporations because interest rates are practically zero. And basically, this is a system of entrenching property rights at the expense of distorting the economy. There's a lot more complicated bits in that story, which I won't go into at the moment, maybe in the questions, because I want to continue with the narrative. Because the next part of the system of rentier capitalism that has emerged is a plunder of the commons. And what that means is that in the pursuit of economic growth, these neoliberals initially said, and Thatcher began it all back in the early 1980s, basically they said that anything is public has a value of zero because it has no price. A park has no price and therefore has no value in their ideology. And the way to increase its value is to sell it or to commodify it. And in doing so, you increase measured economic growth, but you privatize common assets that belong to all of us. And in my book, Plunder of the Commons, I show how that has been done systematically, how we've seen a privatization of our nature, a loss of our seabeds. They're auctioning off our seabed. It belongs to us. And yet the royalist state is making billions by auctioning off our seabed. This is ridiculous. 10% of the land that used to be commons in the 1970s have been privatized. And huge subsidies have been going to large-scale landowners. Man I like to mention in this context, because I love saying his name, is the Duke of Buccleuch. Now, the Duke of Buccleuch had inherited the little matter of 277,000 acres of prime land across the country. Minor matter. He inherited that land because he happened to be the 10th descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II. Didn't do a single day's work. And what is disgusting about it is this poor Duke of Buccleuch has been raking in millions in subsidies from the government to help him look after his land. I wish someone would give me just a little bit of that, because I've got no land, but I'd like a little bit of land and I'd like a little bit of that subsidy, but it is ridiculous. And you see conservative MPs like Ian Duncan Smith, who's got a couple of thousand acres of land, also receiving a couple of £1 million in subsidy. This is part of the rentier capitalism. This is part of what we should be attacking. And that leads to the global class structure that's emerged. Because essentially what has happened is that the rents have been defining the new class structure. We have a plutocracy at the top, billionaires who are not the top 1%, but the top 0.001%, who make billions during the COVID pandemic, just as they make billions when there's no pandemic, and they vastly increase their wealth. 99% of their income comes from property. Essentially below them is an elite serving their interests, also benefiting from property. And then you have the salariat. When I was a student of economics at Cambridge, we basically thought by the end of the 20th century, the vast majority of people would be in salaried employment with pensions, with paid leave, with this, that, and the other. But they've been shrinking the salariat, and more of the income of the salariat is coming in forms of property. They've done very well during the COVID. So you've got a top 30% who've done rather well out of COVID, out of the financial crash. You can document that, how it's happened. Now, the old proletariat, the bulk of whom was the base of the Labour Party and the Social Democrats in the early part of the last century, has been shrinking and diminishing in strength. And more have become reactionary in a double sense. And then underneath that, you have the growing precariat. And the precariat is defined in three dimensions, not one. Too many people talk about precarious work, a term I hate. It's not about precarious work, whatever that might mean. Essentially, people in the precariat are being disciplined to accept a life of unstable, insecure labor and have to do a lot of work for labor that doesn't get counted or remunerated, and are lacking any sense of occupational development in what they do. And it's the first class in history whose level of education is greater than the level of jobs and labor they are expected to do. That's the obvious part of the precariat. More interesting is the second part, which is that more and more they're having to rely almost entirely on money wages. They're losing enterprise benefits. They're losing access to rights-based state benefits. They're losing the rights to occupational benefits. They're losing the rights to the commons. And they're all living on the edge of unsustainable debt. It's the third part of the precariat, the dimension which is the most important of all. And that is people in the precariat are losing the rights of citizenship. They're losing social rights, they're losing cultural rights, they're losing economic rights, they're losing political rights in the system. And in that regard, they are becoming what is the crucial point. They are becoming supplicants. They're having to rely on discretionary decisions by bureaucrats, by parents, by landlords, by employers. And this is the most undignified way of having to live. Having to rely on people doing them favors or not penalizing them in some unaccountable way. I was always hoping that David Lammy would take this issue up, because the loss of civil rights has been one of the terrible tragedies being faced by the precariat. Being a supplicant is undignified, it's the worst form of inequality, and it's a way of capturing a narrative. Because I can tell you, and I've addressed dozens of groups of precariat, and they know this, and they can get angry with it. Why aren't we appealing to them and saying we are going to change that? We're going to give rights, we're going to help. And that, of course, leads to what I've been advocating for the past 30 years, which is a basic income. Because our income distribution system has broken down. It won't come back. We need to give people a sense of basic security, enhance their freedom, enhance their dignity. And we will only do that if we change the nature of our social protection system. The Tories and the old laborists like Liam Byrne and others who supported means testing have reached the end of the line with universal credit. You can't get worse than universal credit. It's means tested, behavior tested, sanctions, regressive, dysfunctional, you name it. And it has no moral right to exist. We should be tearing it to bits. We should be saying this is the end of the line of this majoritarian form of old style conservative politics. But yet our leaders seem to be frightened of attacking it. Johnny Reynolds used to tell me before the election that he 100% supported basic income. After the election, he tells me he cannot come out in favor because it's not the time. When the, excuse me, Dave, excuse me, when the will be the time? And on that note, let me say that I think we are in a very interesting point. For reasons that I still find extraordinary, in early 2016, I received an invitation to go and speak to the Bilderberg Group. Now, I can assure you that I have absolutely no sympathy with the Bilderberg Group. For those who don't know it, it was the right-wing elite association set up in 1954 with the world's plutocrats and right-wing politicians being primary members. So I took no notice of this invitation I got because I thought it was a lefty friend of mine pulling my leg. I took no notice. 2 days later, I was in the kitchen and the phone went, and there it was, the Bilderberg Group saying, "Why haven't you responded to our invitation?" And I said, well, I thought it was a big joke. And they convinced me that it wasn't a joke, and I was invited to Bremen to speak to the Bilderberg Group about the precariat, rentier capitalism, and basic income. I asked all my progressive friends around Europe, all those I could get hold of, should I accept? Should I go and address the Bilderberg Group, the enemy, if you like? Every single one of them said, of course you've got to go. Of course you've got to go. You may get roughed up, but you've got to go. So there I was talking about these subjects in early 2016, and right in front of me, literally 2 meters away, sitting, looking like an owl, taking notes as I was speaking, was Henry Kissinger. Now, for those of you of my generation, you will remember that when we were young and fiery, Henry Kissinger was public enemy #1. And for 3 days, while I was in this castle in Bremen, I had this lovely image going through my mind, wanting to go up and put my hand on his shoulder and saying, I'm making a citizen's arrest. Now, what was interesting is that in my talk, I said, please do not be surprised if the atavistic part of the precariat votes for Donald Trump. And they could tip the balance, so you may have a president, Donald Trump. And don't be surprised in Britain if that comparable group doesn't vote for Brexit. And therefore, Brexit will be won and Trump will win. Now, Lindsey Graham, the senator who's backing Trump, he asked to have breakfast with me the next day. And I said, look, I'm not wanting those things. I'm merely saying that nobody is addressing from the left the insecurities that are leading people to want yesterday back, because nobody's offering a tomorrow that is better. But the good news is this. Today, I believe that atavistic part of the precariat that voted the Tories in 2019 is beyond its peak in size, getting older. And the progressive part of the precariat, young, educated, people who care about the ecology, who care about distribution issues, who care about wanting a better future in which work is revived rather than labor in jobs, jobs, jobs. But I want to have a different type of future, an ecological future, a restoration of the commons. This part of the precariat has grown and grown and grown. In 2016, they were confronted by the Remainers led by Cameron, promising continuation of austerity, and the Leavers led by Johnson and Farage and others promising to bring back yesterday in a stupid way. What did they do? They stayed at home. And we are still in that situation where if we're not very careful and if we don't have a better narrative and we don't have a better vision of a good society of the future, they will continue to stay at home. And then we on the left will not win again. But we must take heart, because they won't vote Tory. The Tories only got 29% of the electorate's support in the general election of 2019. It's up to grabs. But we have to have the courage. And I say to all my friends in the Labour Party, every one of you, we have to put pressure on our spokespeople to get rid of their spaghetti spines and to stand up and actually define a future, because that's where we are today. So thanks very much for listening to me. If you want to chat, I'm happy to do so. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much indeed, Guy. That's absolutely superb. What I want to do now for everyone here is I would like to open it up to questions. And the way I'm going to do it is that if you raise your hand, as you can see on mine now, hopefully you can, then I will take you in order to ask the questions. So if you want to raise your hand, not physically, but actually on the system, I will take your questions. So come on, let's have a, we got Ray. Ray McHale. Question, please, Ray. Ray, I can't hear you.
Hi. Thanks. That was very interesting, Guy. I was just wondering what were the criticisms of your theories that have been put forward by Marxists. I presume it's something around your view of this new class of precariat.
Shall I answer that, Dave? Shall I answer that question?
If you wouldn't mind, Guy, because we'll take them one at a time.
Okay. Yeah, I think the main criticism has come from that direction. And I've become aware that most of the people who've taken that line have actually not read the book. And I've met a number of them who've attacked me. And I said, well, look, actually, if you read the book, it doesn't say that at all. It says something quite different. The term dangerous class was actually used in the 19th century to define those people who were not part of the bourgeoisie, nor part of the emerging proletariat. And they were the craftspeople, they were the traders, they were the artists. And we had a historical moment where the left had a choice to make, really. One was to go with laborism and the battalions who wanted everybody to be in labor and decent labor and in jobs, and it emerged as full employment. And those around people like William Morris, whom I regard as a mentor and a great socialist, who were wanting to build the commons, to build a craft-based society, to build a different form of guild socialism, if you like. And though that group lost out in the 1890s, So we had the big battalions who wanted everybody to be doing labor, which went to in absurd proportions in the Soviet constitution under Lenin, all supporting things like Taylorism and scientific management and the division of labor and the discipline of labor, which was not really an emancipatory left. I think that was a historical error. But the dangerous class was a concept which was saying, look, we are not suffering from false consciousness of wanting to be in labor all the time. We want to be free from labor, free to do work, free to have leisure, free to be creative, free to pursue education for its own sake, free to revive the commons. And that, I think, is part of the agenda. And you can't do it in the old class terms of the 19th century. I'm a Marxist by training and by intellect, but I don't believe that Marx, if he were alive today, would still be talking about the proletariat being the vanguard of the revolution. He basically would have said that was the period of industrial capitalism of the 19th century. But we're in the 21st century and we have a different class structure where the interests and aspirations of the precariat are quite different. The precariat don't identify with old-styled laborism of the trade unions and the TUC, for example, as I'm constantly telling my friend Jeff Tilley, who's the chief economist in the TUC. But there's one way I could clear the room when I'm talking to a precariat group, is to start talking about trade unions. I think that's sad. That's really sad. But it's because the trade unions have not adapted to what the precariat is all about. And therefore, I think I'm not worried about that criticism. I've answered it in various respects. The new edition of the Precariat has just come out. I've tried to give an extended answer in the new introduction. But I think it's created a space for debate. And more of those people who initially criticized me and said it's a stupid concept are now using the term. And great. I mean, and many of them are my friends, so I'm glad of that.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Guy. We've got a new member who's on for the first time for the Many Mondays, and that is Shanti. Shanti, welcome. Your question, please, and remember to unmute.
Now, I agree with your analysis of modern capitalism, essential capitalism. Now, there is an analysis of along those lines, but not as complete as yours, that also comes from defenders of the old capitalism, that what we have is not capitalism as we used to understand it. In 1988, chair of the London Stock Exchange, in a testimony to Parliament, said that we are creating a system of robber barons, modern-day robber barons in the corporate boardrooms. They're basically stealing from everybody, including shareholders. Now, what I do find is something that those that call ourselves socialists, especially the leaders who grew up in the 1960s, grew up thinking that there was nothing good about capitalism. Then they came to power in 1997, and they thought there was nothing bad about capitalism. They were wrong before, and they were wrong now. How do we put your analysis in a context where we change people's perception, make people understand that there was something liberal and good about old capitalism? Lots of things that were bad. And what we have got is a system which is not even that capitalism, is much, much worse. So the first thing to do is to cut it back, get back to some form of capitalism from which we can then build our socialist aspiration. How do you do that without being called a reactionary?
Well, I called my book The Corruption of Capitalism, which sounds like an oxymoron to many of us, because capitalism is inherently corrupt. But the corruption I was referring to is that it's a corruption of their claims. They claim that they believe in capitalism and free markets. But what they've actually created is the opposite of that. That's the points I was making today. And there's a long chapter on the corruption of our institutions and the corrupt nature of the interaction of the plutocracy with finance, with the Conservative Party, where you have revolving doors, where people go from Goldman Sachs into senior political positions, and from senior political positions back into Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or the various other financial institutions. And you're absolutely right that the New Labour people continued that behavior. Blair went from being prime minister to being a major property owner, and Mandelson and various people I show in the book, they all went into banks. And of course, that's been the case. Now, what is remarkable is that we have a system of capitalism today where Goldman Sachs provides most of the political positions across the world. It is a remarkable phenomenon. So Sunak gets his apprenticeship, 4 years of apprenticeship in Goldman Sachs. And when he becomes chancellor, he appoints as senior advisors people from Goldman Sachs. And you can go through it in detail at Goldman Sachsism. But the new kid on the block, as I've described in the new introduction to the book, is BlackRock. Now, BlackRock is a manager of global shares and stocks, and it basically commands 20% of global stocks and shares through its algorithm called Aladdin. And today, the top three of the 4 economic advisors to the Biden administration are from BlackRock. And if it makes me seem worse than before, I was invited to Davos, where I had a long public debate with Larry Fink, who is the chief executive of BlackRock. And he could have become Treasury Secretary, but he declined it because he's doing very nicely, making his billions from BlackRock. So we have a corruption of it, a system, which goes through all the institutions, which is institutionalized corruption. And we should be focusing on exposing that. Because the first hurdle, and this is where I agree with your theme, Shanti, the first hurdle is to say, we first of all can get a better type of capitalism. We need the negation of the negation, to use a Hegelian term, in the sense that the near-term future must be defined in getting rid of the worst aspects that we can expose. The Tories can't disown because they're implicated, they own it. Those are the themes I was making, I hope, in the books and the talk. So for me, it is a crab-like process, but it must be driven by a vision of what a good society looks like. I don't hear that in the Labour leadership. I did with John. We talked over many meals and things, and I understood that. Mark, I think Mark Drakeford is really a passionate, good man. He understands that. He's the sort of person we need to be supporting. But we basically got to be telling them you've got to have this critical narrative plus a vision. You need both, and we're not getting either. So, you know, I agree with your assessment, but I hope we don't stop at that point.
That's fine again. That's great. I've noticed that very few people want to ask you a question. So I'm going to attempt a question myself. You said right at the very end of your talk, you said that there is hope, and the hope is with the youth. How are we going to actually galvanize the youth when a lot of us you see here now are quite old?
Well, that's a very good question, Dave, but it reflects the fact that the left has not articulated this vision. I mean, I've given well over 500 talks on the precariat around the world, as I mentioned in my speech. I've just come back from Denmark, where I was invited to speak to a big folk school festival of young people. There were hundreds there. And the energy and enthusiasm was fantastic, I've given talks where there have been thousands, not hundreds of people. And the energy out there is enormous. One of the things I feel that we should emphasize is we need to revive the commons. Why I mentioned that is that it's a way of actually forging useful class alliance issues that would enable us to mobilize the educated part of the salariat who don't like to see nature being destroyed, nature being privatized, financialization of our commons, and they understand the commons. And that, I think, is where we can get an alliance between the precariat and parts of other classes, that sort of issue. Now, I thought Ed Miliband was going to take this up because I had a long discussion with him about needing a charter of the commons. And we need that sort of thing because then we will mobilize young people. You see the Extinction Rebellion, you see the ecological energy and the fire. You see the Gilets jaunes in France. We had a whole lot of people come to one of our conferences on basic income held in Finland from the French Gilets jaunes. There is a lot of energy out there. The problem is that the Labour Party is not changing and offering that vision. And that's why it's so frustrating. And, you know, I'm very pleased to be working with Yanis Varoufakis, who shares my sort of perspective with DM25. And we're having a conference this week, and they invited me to Athens, and we had a huge conference in Athens because my books have been translated into Greek. And there is that energy, but it's up to the Labour Party or others to mobilize that energy.
Yes, we've got to, haven't we? We've got to mobilize that energy. I've got another question here for you. It's from a friend of mine, Linda. Well, there's a few Lindas on, aren't there? This is Linda.
This Linda.
Oh, it's Linda Webb.
It's Linda. It's Linda.
Linda Webb.
I'd be interested to know what suggestions you have for regaining control of the narrative. For this reason, I live in an area of the country in local government where there's been a massive asset stripping going on, where subsidy by local government for large corporations is already well underway, and where the structures of local government are replicating what's already happening at national level. And apart from being able to go around and asking people who's really benefiting from this, selling the local park, selling 500 acres of public farmland when we've already sold thousands. Apart from asking who benefits, how do we move that narrative away from the kind of spin and presentational politics that we're all stuffed to the gunnels with at the moment?
Well, Linda, this is what I've been trying to do in the book on the plunder of the commons, because the subtitle of that book is A Manifesto for Sharing Public Wealth. And And I drew up a draft charter of the Commons with 44 articles of that charter. And last year, before COVID really took off, Ed actually asked for some ideas for developing an approach on the Commons, as I'd been calling it. And I've been disappointed because he's been, I don't know what's been going on to the extent that he's been muffled. Perhaps he will be liberated now he's got just the portfolio for the environment, because the sort of things you're talking about are about restoring the social environment.
Yes.
And essentially reviving the commons and commoning, sharing and participation. And I think that the COVID pandemic and the shutdowns have actually created an opportunity for us in this respect, because a lot of people no longer see themselves entirely in terms of their jobs and their labor positions, and are seeing themselves wanting allotments, wanting to spend more time in nature, wanting to spend more time caring for each other and the community. And I think it's broken the false consciousness of a lot of people. You know, it's called the Great Resignation. And I think there's something potentially fantastic there. But again, it's got to be articulated by our political leaders. And maybe we have to wait for a next generation who will have the courage and the vocabulary to be able to do that. But at the moment, they're muffled because they seem frightened of themselves. They feel they just don't seem to have any guts. And that, I think, is up to us to be telling our people, look, if you're going to get us supporting you and you need us, then let's hear it. Let's see some more courage from you. Because it is down to that, really.
Well, yeah. And I certainly agree with you there, Guy. You do energize me in so many ways. But the most important thing is that you articulate yourself away well enough for me as a non-economist to understand what you're talking about. And I can thoroughly recommend the book, which I bought from you. All right. You even signed it for me, which I thought was wonderful. But anybody who wants a decent Christmas present so they can sit away in a corner and understand economics a lot better than maybe they understand it now, then I recommend your book very highly. I also would listen to you for a long, long time, because your enthusiasm shines through incredibly. And thank you very, very much, not only for the 2 talks at For the World Transformed, where there were a lot of young people and a couple of old so-and-sos like me, but also for coming to join us this evening. Guy, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very, very much indeed.